Good morning and welcome again to Coffee with Mr. V. And as you can see, my hair is most definitely getting longer. I was checking out some earlier episodes, kind of episode 1 and 2 the other day, and there is a noticeable difference in the size of my hair. It is definitely getting longer. Anyway, today's focus is going to be on tariffs and specifically the tariff diagram. So if you're in the upper sixth, then this is just simply revision. If you're in the lower sixth, you've got this to come. A level fairly soon, and then the IB probably after the summer. Okay. Well, you know the score by now. Go and grab yourself a coffee or whatever your favorite liquid is. Put it in a mug, a glass, or a cup, and then come back to me, and we will do the synchronized sip, and that is going to be the best part of your day. So here we go. I love coffee. Right, tariff diagrams. So first of all, let's just explain what a tariff is. A tariff is an indirect tax passed on to the sale of an import. Okay, so we've done indirect taxes before. We did them back in microeconomics, and we did that for specific taxes, and we did that for ad valorem indirect taxes. Okay, so we've kind of already looked at indirect taxes. So the tariff diagram, shouldn't be too difficult, but there's just a couple of different things about the tariff diagram specifically that we need to take care of. So the tariff diagram then, just to reiterate, is an indirect tax that is imposed on the sale of imports. Okay, so here is our demand and supply diagram for a given good. I suppose it doesn't really matter at this stage what it is, but I don't know, why don't we say it's a pair of trousers? Okay, so this is the demand and the supply for trousers in the UK. So this is the UK trouser market. And at the moment, we have consumers, UK consumers, obviously, and we have just domestic suppliers. So I'm going to call that SDOM. All right, the DOM is for domestic. This is just our domestic suppliers of trousers. That gives us kind of P1 and Q1. So Q1 number of trousers will be bought, okay, from UK suppliers, and that's the key thing to realize here. But of course, over in different parts of the world, they probably make trousers a hell of a lot cheaper than we can make them here. So we sell our trousers here at P1, but I reckon they could make them for something down here, which is about a third of the price. So what we can say is that this here is the world price. Okay, this is actually how cheaply you can buy trousers on the world market. It's quite a bit cheaper than P1. And of course, the world is a large place compared to the size of the UK. I mean, we might have a population of 60 million, but that pales into comparison of the size of the world, which is nearer to 6 billion. Okay, now, what we can say here is that the world can supply essentially an infinite amount of trousers to the UK market. Now, it's not literally infinite, but it could certainly satisfy all the demand for trousers in the UK and some. Okay, so it's essentially infinite. Well, the way you show infinite supply at a particular price is you draw a perfectly elastic supply curve. All right, PES is infinite. We can call this S world. Again, this supply curve is meant to represent all of the output, all of the trousers that could be made by world producers. Okay, and what we're saying is the world could supply the UK with essentially an infinite amount of trousers at the world price, which is much lower than the UK price. Okay, so what? Well, let's analyze this diagram first of all. What it tells us is that at PW, okay, people in the UK, we can get rid of Q1 now, all right? People in the UK would demand that many trousers, okay? A hell of a lot more than Q1 because it's so cheap to buy trousers from foreign producers. We also know that UK producers wouldn't do so well when competing with foreign producers. That's because only these UK producers here would actually be competitive at P World. All right, remember this supply curve is a marginal cost curve. Okay, so if we were here, somewhere here, what we'd be saying is the price is lower than the marginal cost of making trousers. And so no firm in the UK is going to want to bother making those trousers. So only that many trousers can be produced by competitive UK firms. So where do all the rest of the trousers come from? Imports. So this distance here between QD and QS are the number of trousers that we are importing into the UK. Okay, we can call it M, or we could even call it M1. On the other hand, this distance here from the origin to QS, okay, that's the number of domestic sales, not very much. But as we say, not many UK producers of trousers could be competitive at the world price. So given this situation, it's not surprising to think that what a government might do, what the UK government might do here, is to impose a tax, a tariff, an indirect tax, on imported trousers. We want to reduce the number of imports so that our domestic producers can get back to producing and we can get some jobs back into the trouser industry. So we're going to impose an indirect tax, but only onto foreign producers. And that's the key here. We're leaving our domestic suppliers alone, nothing to do with them. In fact, we're trying to help them out. Okay, but we are doing an indirect tax. We are imposing an indirect tax on our producers. And our producers, our foreign producers, are represented by this perfectly elastic supply curve here. So let's impose a tax, a couple of pounds per unit. Okay, and we simply do what we always do, is we shift the supply curve upwards, I guess, in this case. Previously, like I say, we were doing it like that. Okay, but again, it's still upwards. Okay, and the more you rotate that, you can see that the difference would be there. Okay, we do this because we're essentially saying the marginal cost of production was there, but then we add the tax on to the producer, at that point there. Okay, now it doesn't matter whether it's a unit tax or a percentage tax at this point, because remember the world price is staying the same. So whether you're adding a percentage or a unit, the taxes are still the same. So it's a parallel shift upwards. Okay, and the difference between those two lines is T. Because it's perfectly elastic, all of the tax has been passed on to the consumer. So the new price is PW plus T. Okay, none of it has been passed on to the, all of it's been passed on to the consumer, and none of it has been taken on by the producer. Okay, so let's have a look at what's happened. Now that the price has gone up from PW to PW plus T, less consumers want to buy less. Well, that's fairly standard. Okay, the demand curve shows us what consumers are willing and able to buy at any given price. And since prices have gone up, our demand has now fallen. It also means that some UK producers are essentially back in the game. Okay, they can be competitive. They couldn't be competitive before because the prices were too low and didn't cover their marginal costs. But now all of these UK domestic producers can get back in, all right? Suddenly the new higher price does cover their marginal costs, and so they can produce and be competitive again. So we have an increase in the number of trousers supplied by UK producers. So what's happened to imports? Well, from the demand side, they've fallen from QD to QD1. And from the supply side, they've also fallen from QS to QS1. So the new level of imports are here, M2. So imports have shrunk from the orange to the red. From the domestic producers' point of view, okay, they've actually done quite well out of this. They were only producing from the origin to QS, now they're producing from the origin to QS1. So, you know, the way I've drawn it, it's essentially doubled the domestic sales. And there is our tariff diagram, essentially showing us how tariffs can be successful at reducing imports. If I very quickly just do this again, but with numbers, okay, hopefully you can do this in your head. Okay, so here's S world at P world, and let's choose something like that. Before the tariff, let's not have the tariff quite so soon. Before the tariff, there were 170 imports and domestic sales were only 50. Then we had the tariff. And I know this won't be a proper linear function or anything like that, but I'm just using the numbers to show you. Okay, now we have 100 and 180. So the new level of tariffs is, sorry, the new level of imports is just 80. So in this case, we've managed to reduce imports by 90. So that's a fairly successful tariff if our aim was to reduce imports by quite a substantial percentage. Right, other things then just to think about with the tariff diagram are things like consumer and producer surplus. So where was the consumer surplus beforehand? Well, consumer surplus, remember, is the difference between what consumers were willing and able to buy at, shown by the demand curve, and what they did buy at, which initially was PW, okay? So it's just the difference between the demand curve and PW, so it's that enormous big triangle there, okay? However, now that we've got the tariff, people aren't buying as much, the price world has gone up, and so actually our consumer surplus is just that triangle there. So we've kind of lost that trapezium out of consumer surplus. So consumers, just making sure I've got enough room here, consumers are losing out from the tariff. They're losing out because consumer surplus has gone down. They're losing out because prices have gone up and their purchasing power of their income, therefore, has gone down. Domestic producers, on the other hand, producer surplus, remember, is just the difference between what people were willing and able to sell at and what they did sell at. That's shown by the supply curve, the difference between the supply curve and PW. So it was very small, okay, to begin with. They didn't have much producer surplus going on. But now, given that the price has gone up, their producer surplus has increased. So domestic producers, DOM producers, are happy. They're happy from the point of view that their producer surplus has gone up. You could also do the same thing with revenue. This little rectangle here would have represented revenue before the tariff. This rectangle now represents revenue after the tariff. So from that point of view, from a revenue point of view, they're happy. Or you could just do sales. You could just say they were selling 0 QS, now they're selling 0 QS1. How about the government? Okay, the government, we all know that when you impose taxes, that the government collects some revenue. Why else would they do it? Okay, so where is the government revenue? Okay, if you're seeing this as revision, you know, but if you're seeing this for the first time, then you just got to think about the maths. Okay, how would you find government revenue? Well, revenue, remember, is just P times Q. So tax revenue would just be tax or unit tax times Q, the quantity being taxed. Well, remember, we're not taxing our domestic sales, we're only taxing our imports. So we'd only be taxing 80 units here. On here, we're only taxing QS1, QD1, right? And how big is the tax? Well, it's T. So it's T times QS1 times QS, T times QS1, QD1, which gives you this rectangle here, all right? This rectangle here is the government revenue collected from the tariff. So government is happy. They are collecting more money from this. Now, if you stop to think about this, okay, we're left with these two tiny triangles that haven't been shaded in. What I'm talking about is this was all consumer surplus, remember? Okay, before this big triangle, but we lost some consumer surplus, but we lost that rectangle, that trapezium. Some of that has been regained by the producers and some of it has been regained by the government. However, some of it did not get regained by anyone, and therefore we can label it A and B. Therefore, there is a welfare loss. There is a welfare loss to society. Okay, welfare loss, remember, or welfare is just consumer surplus plus producer surplus. But in the second scenario, after the tariff has been imposed, we have actually lost community surplus. Okay, again, the loss of consumer surplus partially has been countered by the increase in producer surplus and government revenue, but not completely. We're kind of missing out on a society in terms of welfare, so social welfare has fallen. Last stakeholder to think about is the foreign producers, and they're obviously not doing as well. They've seen their own sales kind of cut in half from the diagram over there, from 170 to 80. So they're really, really losing out. So from a foreign producer's point of view, foreign producers, they're unhappy. Now, to what extent should we care about that? Well, I guess the UK government probably doesn't care so much about foreign producers as they do about domestic producers and domestic employment. But this may now lead to a trade war. This may now lead to retaliation, because if we're taxing foreign producers such that they're losing out on their own revenue, it's likely that that country will do the same to us. And there we go. Okay, tariff diagrams. There's your analysis. Those are all the things you'd ever be expected to do with a tariff diagram, plus a small little evaluation here. Is it good or bad? Well, it depends from whose perspective you're thinking about it. Consumers and governments are pretty happy. Domestic producers and governments are pretty happy. Consumers, society, social welfare, foreign producers, not so happy. Anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks for joining me. Check you out next time. Bye.